Greetings to all attendees and welcome to the second session of the Islamic History and Thought lecture series organized by the Institute of Ismaili Studies. This new series is designed to invite scholars to present their research on topics related to intellectual, social, and political aspects of medieval and early modern Islamic societies. 6 lectures will take place throughout 2021. The next 2 lectures has been announced on the IIS website, and registrations are now open for the next one in April. So for the presentation by Dr. Edmund Hayes, who will present on the agents of the hidden Imam forging 12-verse Shiism. And this next lecture after that in June will be delivered by Dr. Salime Marsoudlou, who will speak about scholars, apostasy and states in medieval Islam, historiographical and juridical issues. So registrations will soon be open for this one as well. And it will be mainly about Ayn al-Qudat al-Hamadani and Shihab al-Din Yahya Sohrawardi. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Wissam Halawi, who is an assistant professor of Islamic social and cultural history at the Institute of History and Anthropology of Religion within the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. Wissam Halawi has published several articles in academic journals, essentially on medieval Druze history. His research interests include social history of Islam, history of Islamic law, history of religious minorities in the world of Islam, among other topics. He obtained his PhD from the University of Sorbonne in Paris in 2016. And after this, he held a postdoctoral position at the University of Exeter within the ERC project, Law, Authority and Learning in Imami Shiite Islam, which is led by Professor Robert Cleave. So Dr. Halawi's dissertation was recently published under the title, just a second, under the title Les Druzes aux marges de l'Islam, Ésotérisme et normativité en milieu rural, 14e-16e siècle. So this lecture will thus be dedicated to his groundbreaking research, largely based on unedited and hitherto unknown sources. This lecture will last for about 30 to 45 minutes, after which it will be discussed by myself and Dr. Christian Sanner, who kindly accepted to take part in this session. So Dr. Sanner is an associate professor in Islamic history at the Oriental Institute of the University of Oxford, and he's particularly interested in the history of religious minorities in the Islamic medieval world, as well as in the history of conversions. Dr. Sanner will be delivering a lecture in this very series in October, so I will have another opportunity to present his work in more detail. During the lecture and the following discussion, the public is strongly encouraged to send their questions in writing through the Q&A option at the bottom of the control panel. And as time allows, I will convey as much of your questions to the speaker. I will now give the floor to Dr. Wissam Halawi. Hello, Wissam.
Thanks, Fârès, for your kind invitation and presentation. And thanks for Christian for accepting to participate to this debate. And also, I would like to thank the IIS and all the attendees to be here and to listen to my talk. So I will first share my screen so we can go on good basis. So in this talk today, I will explore the evolution of Druzism from an esoteric doctrine according to the Ismaili vision to a madhab, that is a doctrinal school of law. We will see how in the 11th century in Cairo, Imam Hamza, the founder of the Druze faith, developed a new doctrine of Tawheed, the oneness of God, which was close to those called Ghulat. Furthermore, Hamza proscribed the entire body of substantive Islamic law, the Sunni as well as the Shiite one. Yet, 4 centuries later, in the late 15th century, Druze jurists in the mountainous regions of Syria established a legal doctrine influenced particularly by the Shafi'i law. To show that, I will use the case of marital violence as elaborated in Druze law. I will finally discuss the rural social context in Syria, where the formation of a Druze madhab took place in the end of the 15th century, and I will show how Druze jurists aimed to establish a legal doctrine to maintain the social cohesion of their community. But beforehand, I will go over the formation and development of the Druze movement. Well, the Druze movement was founded by Ismaili preachers, dais, in Cairo in the early 11th century under the reign of the 6th Fatimid Caliphate al-Hakim. Medieval Arabic sources mention 3 main dais, Hamza, al-Darazi, and al-Akhram. The Druze dawah or predication lasted from 1017 to 1042-43 and can be considered as the formative period of Druzism. During the dawah, Hamza, one of the 3 Ismaili dais that we've just mentioned, took control of the movement and declared himself Imam. In fact, the sole Druze Imam. He wrote 35 treaties, which are the first 35 epistles of the actual Druze sacred book called the Hikmah, and commonly known as Epistles of Wisdom. In his last epistle, the 35th, Hamza announced his imminent occultation in 1021, just a few months after the death of the Fatimid Caliphate al-Hakim. After the occultation of Hamza, the Druze dawah was led by Al-Muqtana, another Ismaili da'i who is the author of epistles 41 to 111 of the Hikmah. The occultation of Al-Muqtana took place in 1042-43, after which the dawah was definitively closed. Druzism subsequently disappeared from Cairo after the death of Caliphate al-Hakim and Imam Hamza in 1021, although it survived in the mountains of Syria where it is still present today. The teachings of Hamza and Al-Muqtana were shared with a few families in Syria during the dawah. These families that converted to Druzism did not, however, constitute an organized community as such. This may explain the absence of normative treaties in the Hikmah. In fact, as we will see in a while, the Hikmah helped elucidate the new Druze spiritual and moral doctrine to recent converts and responded to their questions mainly on religious and ethical matters. Several specialists have shed light on early Druze religious doctrine, in particular Daniel de Smet, who has continued the work begun by Sylvestre Sassid 2 centuries ago. De Smet situated the first 40 epistles of the Hikmah in the Ismaili intellectual context of the 11th century. In my work, I focus on the development of Druze communities in Syria in pre-modern times, which means from 11th to 16th century. This period has remained unknown until now, and so has always been described by Druze authors in a biased and ideological way. In fact, current Druze writers considered that some kind of revival occurred in the 15th century, a religious and legal revival that they attribute to a semi-legendary person who is called Emir Al-Sayed Al-Tannuhi. We will come back to him later. Let us now focus on the esoteric Ismaili aspect of Druze dogma as established by Imam Hamza. Druze faith confers the status of Nasut on Al-Hakim. Nasut means God's physical image on earth, or even a better translation into English would be the humanity of the human figure of God. However, there is no evidence that the Druze spiritual doctrine was elaborated under the Caliph supervision, as affirmed by Imam Hamza in the Hikmah, even though Al-Hakim did show leniency towards the Druze movement by allowing its development under his reign. Either way, Druze doctrine redefines the doctrine or the concept of Tawheed in Islam, the Tawheed or the oneness of God being the main doctrine that distinguishes the Druze from other Islamic communities, even Ismaili ones. Like the Shiites and the Ismailis, the Druze have a dual view of things, so that every concept, notion, or reality has exoteric, dhahir, and esoteric, batin significance. Thus, the Quran represents in the eyes of the Druze an exoteric and apparent text, with whose hidden or inner meaning is only held by the Imam. But the doctrine of imamate differs radically from that of other Shia communities. First, the imamate is not a dynastic or hereditary institution, as we can see among the Twelvers or the Fatimids or even the Nizaris. So Hamza is the only Druze imam. Secondly, the spiritual dogma of the Druze is a Neoplatonic doctrine like the other Ismaili groups. Though Imam Hamza, who was an Ismaili Da'i and who established the foundations of the Druze doctrine, showed great originality in adapting the Ismaili thought to his needs. Thus, he declared himself not only as Imam, but also as the intellect, aql, the one who will return to earth at the end of time to establish justice among people. According to the Druze faith, the intellect, which means Hamza himself, has the same soul in a different body as Salman al-Farisi during the prophetic period, and as Jesus during the Christian revelation. Hamza also set the number of the hudud, the cosmic principle, as 5, which are the intellect, the soul, the word, the precedent, and the followers. Aql, nafs, kalima, sabiq, tali. Imam Hamza obviously aimed to distinguish himself from his contemporary Hamid ad-Din al-Kirmani, who was an eminent Fatimid scholar and a da'i in the service of the Fatimid da'wah during the reign of the Caliph al-Hakim. The aim of al-Kirmani was to legitimate the imamate of al-Hakim and to counter extremism, notably that of the Druze missionaries. According to al-Kirmani and to other scholars thereafter, the main Druze extremist doctrine was that of Tawheed. Here is how Hamza outlines the doctrine of Tawheed in the Hikmah, and I quote, "We say that he, Al-Hakim, is the Lord, the Exalted. We perceive only a part of his humanity, while his divinity can enter neither in the imaginations nor in the thoughts. It is he, Al-Hakim, the one, the isolated, the eternal, who has neither companion nor child, and who rises very high above the descriptions and beliefs of heretics, as well as the claims of associators, mushrikun." This is an extract from Epistle 14. This short extract shows how Imam Hamza and the Druze afterwards regard themselves as the only true believers in Islam, so they can call themselves muwahidun, from Tawheed. And their doctrine, they call it the doctrine or religion of Tawheed. From a Druze perspective, all other Muslims are heretics, since they commit the error of associationism, by using human attributes to talk about God, or even speaking of divine and trying to define the esoteric meaning of his attributes. Whereas the Druze faith views the divinity, the Lahut, as ineffable, unreachable, unapproachable even. In doing so, the Druze aim to know the humanity of the Nasut without ever mentioning the ineffable. Otherwise, in their opinion, they would commit associationism. The concept of Tawheed, like other religious questions related to the cosmic and the physical realms, are developed in the Druze sacred book. The epistles written by the Imam Hamza elaborate the Druze dogma and faith, while Al-Muqtana, in his writings, deals mainly with the organization of the da'wah in rural Syria during the reign of the Caliph Al-Zahir, the son and successor of Al-Hakim, who banned the Druzism in Egypt. At that time, the Druze in Cairo regained their ancient religion or belief. Only Syrian rural families continued to develop their faith secretly. Back then, Druzism was still most likely an esoteric doctrine within Islam, a aqidah. The Druze community became more visible in Syria mainly in the 15th century. When I say visible, it means that believers who belonged to local families and clans then began to organize themselves into religious communities whose scholars established strict legal rules and community justice. The first Druze legal treaties go back to the 15th century. The Druze jurists of that time were mainly concerned with marriage and divorce, as well as with the status of women within the community. They also wrote legal treaties to regulate inheritance, education, intercourse, trade, and so on. The authors of these treaties had this in common. They all belonged to the same rural area, which is the Gharb. You can see it here on the map. The Gharb that we can translate into the West, and which was in Syria, in the mountains of Syria at that time, and which is, it's an area which is in modern day Lebanon. Also, they recognized the authority of the same spiritual leader, the famous Emir Al-Sayed al-Tannuhi that we've already mentioned. And they followed a common legal doctrine. That's why we can consider that they constituted the first and only Druze madhab that ever existed in Druze history. The area called the West, where the Druze madhab emerged, was since the 14th century under the control of local emirs belonging to the Bahtur clan, who claimed to belong to the Tannuh tribe. So under Mamluk rule, the Bahturid emirs embodied power in the Gharb region of Syria, earning them the title of the emirs of the Gharb. They were recognized by the Mamluk authorities, owned properties, amlak, and had land concessions, iqta', and levied taxes in the name of the Sultan. Members of the Bahtur clan were Druze, although no chronicler mentions this. Some historians, like Kamal Salibi, have claimed that Bahturid emirs practiced taqiyya or dissimulation out of political interest in order to be accepted by the Mamluk authorities. The truth is that these emirs were not religious, so they identified themselves as Muslims without giving more importance to Druzism. Some other members of this clan, the Buhturid clan, were not political leaders, but rather scholars or religious persons. The most popular one was the Emir Al-Sayed. Like Emir Al-Sayed, other Druze spiritual leaders existed at that time in rural Syria, although they left us with no written texts. However, what sets Al-Sayed apart from them is that he was a religious leader and also belonged to the local elite of the Gharb. So he enjoyed both spiritual and material prestige. Emir Al-Sayed had many disciples belonging to the villages of Gharb and Shuf that you can see on the map, which were two neighboring areas. Some of these disciples described his teachings and actions, though in an exaggerated way. Based on oral akhbar traditions, Druze historians have always approached this subject in an ideological and communal manner. According to them, Emir Al-Sayed was the greatest Druze reformer of all time, since he has broken away from the darkness of previous age. They describe this earlier period just as Arab authors of the Abbasid period described the Jahiliyyah. According to these authors, the Druze before Al-Sayed ignored their religious doctrine and respected neither morals nor social ethics. Druze historiography thus regards Emir Al-Sayed as the person who revealed the hidden meaning of the hikmah and who established the madhab and developed Druze law. In fact, although Emir Al-Sayed was a great religious leader, we can clearly affirm that the founders of Druze theology and law were his disciples and their students. The formation of Druze madhab as a doctrinal school of law took place in the late 15th century after the death of Emir Al-Sayed, in order to organize the community and give it a distinct religious identity. At the time, political and social crises in Syria in the late Mamluk period helped the Druze fuqaha or jurists, especially those from powerful local family, mainly the Banu Buhtur that we've mentioned, to gain visibility and to attract disciples. These jurists formulated new legal teachings to organize their community around strict religious and moral traditions, which, in their view, conformed to the will of Imam Hamza as expressed in the Hikmah. Their legal treaties were later collected in two still unpublished volumes, Sharh al-Mithaq and Sharh al-Shart, which I call the Sharhain or the Great Exegesis. These Druze fiqh books belonged to the genre of legal exegesis. They commented on epistles 5 and 23 of the Hikmah, and in doing so, developed a legal doctrine that differed from other Islamic schools of law. Contemporary Druze scholars view these early legal books as theological texts that explain the Druze religious system, which is kept secret from laymen. Laymen for Druze religious people are non-Druze, but also uninitiated Druze. For this reason, current Western specialists have paid little attention to Druze legal doctrine. They view Druzism as a school of theology only and wrongly consider that the Druze have followed Ottoman Hanafi law. The Great Exegesis are the only legal treaties in Druzism. To this day, Druze religious authorities continue to study them and produce oral commentaries, ta'liqat, on them, because this body of legal literature refers to the sacred text of the Hikmah, it is only accessible to initiated Druze. Initiated Druze means people who are initiated to the Druze doctrine, or religious people if you prefer. Besides that, pre-modern Druze scholars produced an esoteric tradition on Quranic exegesis, of Quranic exegesis, sorry. They accused their contemporaries in other madahib of altering the meaning of the Quran and thus of unbelief, kufr. Based on the teachings of the Druze Imam in the Hikmah, Druze jurists radically refuted Muslim law, the Shara. They also abrogated the 7 pillars of Imamism and Ismailism. Nevertheless, the foundations of the Druze religious system, as well as the Druze Usul al-Din and Usul al-Fiqh, are Ismaili. So we can consider Druzism as a branch of Ismailism. On the other hand, Druze scholars were inspired by the fiqh education that they received in Damascus from Sunni professors and by the writings of their Sunni contemporaries, although they banned all Sunni legal doctrines. So this is the contradiction. To show that, I will take the example of marital violence in Druze law. While the Hikmah remained silent on this issue, pre-modern Druze jurists forbade any violent conduct towards women. A husband could nevertheless be severe and strict with his wife as long as he has not violent actions with her. Among Druze jurists, the difference between severity and violence was extremely tenuous. Let us read just an extract from Druze law, a treatise, where we can read, he must punish her and compel her to obey in a forceful way. However, he should proceed gradually in her discipline. That is, he first proceeds with admonishment, warning, and intimidation. If he does not succeed, he can shun her. If this does not work, he can beat her, but without inflicting injury, so he hurts her without breaking her bones or causing her body to bleed. Thanks God. He must not slap her face. That is forbidden. So this passage recalls the Quran 4:34, who says, men are in authority over women. If you fear disobedience from your wives, admonish them, then abandon them in bed, then hit them. For the Druze, shunning wives meant avoiding them, not only in bed, as indicated in the Quranic verse, but rather in a general abandonment, including the refusal to engage in conversation. The permissibility of wife beating is nonetheless problematic in Druze fiqh, which clearly forbids any violence towards women. To date, modern Druze scholars have avoided the question of how marital violence is not in conflict with Druze legal doctrine, although they affirm that Druze law is more favorable to wives than mainstream fiqh. In fact, like Shafi'is, pre-modern Druze jurists established the permissibility of wife beating as a last resort. Indeed, the Shafi'i position on wife beating, mainly based on Al-Nawawi, a great legal authority in Mamluk Syria, is most relevant to our case. The Shafi'is state that wife beating is permissible as a last resort, and that a woman who has behaved sinfully can, however, obtain her husband's forgiveness. For this reason, my translation of the verb daraba in the excerpt that I've just quoted is preceded by can instead of must, since the Arabic text uses the indicative mode يضربها rather than imperative اضربها, as we can see in other legal books or treaties, not in Shafi'i madhab. It may be supposed that beating wives formed part of a wife's discipline, ta'dib, in rural Syria at that time, which was the husband's responsibility. Physical violence was thus viewed as a means to help wives seek salvation by preventing sinful actions such as refusing to acquire knowledge, spiritual knowledge, the keystone of the Druze Doctrine. However, Druze jurists sought to restrict the existing customs, thus endorsing that what Aziza Al-Hibri calls the philosophy of gradualism in her article, since husbands were allowed to proceed gradually, tadrijan, in the discipline, ta'dib, of their wives, and to use physical violence only as a last resort. Let us now analyze this legal and conjugal violence in the Druze social milieu. As the Druze were a religious minority in Syria in the 15th century, the main concern of jurists was the survival of their community in a Sunni context. The unity of Druze believers was crucial. Druze scholars thus sought to avoid litigations in all matters of life, including marriage, inheritance, and commercial transactions, and then founded their legal reasoning on a Druze moral precept known as Hafz al-Ikhwan, that we can translate into preserving the brotherhood. This was one of the hikmahs, Hafz al-Ikhwan, was one of the hikmah's 5 precepts, al-Khasa al-Khamsa, that replaced the 5 pillars of Islam because from the Druze perspective, other Muslim jurists lacked sufficient knowledge to interpret the literal meaning of the Quran. The precept of preserving the brotherhood was used as normative precept in Druze law to ensure the survival of the community that had its own rules and authority. In Druze law, the rules on marriage, sexuality, and marital disputes show to which extent Druze jurists were concerned about community cohesion. To ensure social peace, they established a judicial system intended to prevent believers from resorting to harsh solutions like divorce. Indeed, a Druze qadi or judge was not allowed to grant a divorce unless both parties had tried to resolve their disagreements amicably and sought out the mediation of a group of local religious leaders. Moreover, Druze law enabled the qadi to cancel the divorce judgment if he considered, based on a new proof, that a conciliation process would lead to a common agreement between the spouses. According to pre-modern Druze scholars, mediation is a divine will from which the moral precept of preserving the brotherhood derives. The importance accorded to mediation as a means to avoid divorce and thus preserve social harmony sheds light on the Druze vision of gender equality in marriage. To prevent the wife's possible rebellion, which might lead to divorce, she had to consent to the marriage and willingly submit to her husband. For his part, the husband had to be charitable and fair towards her. For Druze jurists, this conjugal equilibrium constituted equality between wives and husbands, and was the only way to preserve marriage, even though the physical violence was possible to educate the wife. The consequences of divorce in the rural milieu where Druze communities evolved should be examined in light of the concept of the extended family or clan, along with the Druze matrimonial strategies implemented in the 14th and 15th centuries. Based on local narrative accounts, we know that members of the Druze community, especially in the Gharb, belonged to local families with a high proportion of internal marriages, or in other words, marriages between members of a limited number of rural families. The formation of the Druze madhab occurred in this social milieu in the late 15th century. So here just you have a graph that shows you how marriages on which we have accounts in local chronicles were done within the same clan. And here we have the same clan, which is the clan of the Buhtur, the Banu Buhtur, and we have 3 family branches, and all members, this is just a part of them, and all members of these families the members of these families married between them. Therefore, divorce was seen as a tough solution that could disturb the understanding between local families. Druze jurists thus aimed to preserve the harmony within their community. They did not exclude the existence of sexual hierarchy, which formed part of the patriarchal society to which they belonged. To conclude very briefly, I think that I don't have any time anymore, I can argue that pre-modern jurists aim to prevent divorces between believers rather than establish a new social order. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, Wissam, for this fascinating presentation. Well, we'll start maybe with Christian, if you have a few comments you want to make, and then I'll probably have some questions, and we will convey some of the questions of the audience as well.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Fârès, for the invitation. Thank you, Wissam, for your presentation and for this wonderful book. I'm lucky to actually have a copy here in my office at the Oriental Institute in Oxford. You can all see how thick this book is. I recommend it strongly to you. It's been a great pleasure to read over the past few days. So this is, I think, a major book in our field. I recommend it to one and all. I want to do 2 things in the next few minutes. I want to explain why I like the book, and then I want to ask Wissam some questions that come out of reading the book as well as his presentation. And I'll use these as a way of maybe getting our group discussion going. So first things first, praise for the book. For those of you who are in the field, I think you'll know that there is exceptionally little written about the Druze in comparison to other corners of, say, medieval Islamic studies. What does exist is often not rigorous, and what does exist is often highly biased. That is to say, it is often written from a strongly confessional point of view, in which the conclusions about the nature of theology, law, belief, and history are pre-decided. So I think Wissam's book stands out not only in that it has opened up or reopened an incredibly interesting field of study, but it has done so in a rigorous and in a historically unbiased way. So I commend him for that. The other thing to say is that it is exceptionally hard to work on the Druze. This is for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, a scholar of the Druze needs the right academic training. They need grounding in the study of the prehistory of the Druze and Ismaili Shi'ism, training in codicology and the rest. And there are not many scholars who have that. I think it's safe to say that Wissam Halawi is on that very short list. The other thing, and this is a preview of a small question I'll ask Wissam in the coming minutes, is that anyone who wishes to work on the Druze, especially with reference to their manuscripts, untapped, unpublished sources, needs a huge amount of patience to overcome the difficulties that that scholar will face. Difficulties in the form of lack of access from within the community. The Druze clergy, who are the custodians, the guardians of so many of these manuscripts, are by and large unwilling, uninterested in collaborating with Western scholars. The scholar who wishes to work on this subject will have to deal with closed libraries. The scholar will have to deal with entrenched cultural taboos in places like Lebanon and Syria. As you will know from reading Wissam's book, you also have to contend with government bans on scholarship, on the publication of these manuscripts. This is part of the unfortunate history of the modern study of the Druze, especially in the 20th century, in the context of Lebanese domestic politics and else. So, in other words, it's exceptionally hard to work on the Druze, and I think Wissam deserves great congratulations and applause for persevering on this very challenging subject. With respect to this book in particular, I think it's a superb marriage of social and intellectual history. That is to say, it's a superb study of the context in which Al-Sayed, the central feature of the book, and his disciples lived, as well as the ideas that they propagated. I think so often in the field of Islamic studies, not just in the study of the Druze, but the field writ large, we often have good social history or we have good intellectual history. We have very few books that really marry the two. And I think that Wissam's book succeeds in doing both extremely well. And then finally, and perhaps I think its biggest impact will be felt in the sense that this book expands and enriches our understanding of what constitutes Islamic studies and what Islam as a broad discursive tradition can mean in a variety of contexts. So I think we live in times in which our definitions of Islam are ever expanding. Islam is not merely the religion of Sunni scholars sitting in cities, but is expanding to encompass the beliefs, practices, and histories of communities that live in marginal geographic areas, minority communities in the Middle Ages as well as today. And so I think to have such a significant and a weighty book about the Druze helps push this narrative of a field of Islamic studies that is capacious and which is flexible and broad in its understanding of what Islam can mean across many geographic and historical contexts. So all that is to say, I think this is a fantastic book, and I commend it to all of you. Now, just a few questions that come out of my reading of this book, and which reflect perhaps some of my idiosyncratic interest in the Druze. As Fârès said in his introduction, one of my areas of research is the study of religious minorities in the Islamic world, subjects like conversion. More generally, I'm interested in the history of Syria from antiquity to the present. So I've had the chance to study the Druze and to teach the history of the Druze, not perhaps as intensively as Wissam, but still I try to introduce my students to here in Oxford. So some questions that emerge from this. The first is, I'd love to hear Wissam talk about who he thinks were the earliest converts to the Druze Da'wah. I think this is something that we have exchanged emails about in the past, but I'd love to hear him speak about it a bit more. Of course, we know that there are tribes in various geographic areas, especially in the Levant, who go over to the Druze Da'wah. Sometimes we have the names of sheikhs, prominent families. But I'm interested to know whether these people were Muslims already. If they were Muslims, were they Ismailis? In which case the Druze Da'wah was a further induction into a tradition that they knew already. When it comes to Bilad al-Sham, are we talking about converts from the substantial Christian population? I think the Druze sources are silent about this, so there may not be a clear answer, but I'd love to know what Wissam thinks about who these people were. In other words, what were they before they became Druze? And perhaps the same question could be asked about a range of other Druze missionary fields. Obviously, Bilad al-Sham, Greater Syria, is the most famous area of the implantation of the da'wah, but we know from the Rasa'il al-Hikmah that Druze missionaries were active, or at least attempted to proselytize in areas as far-flung as Yemen, India, and beyond. So who were these people before they became Druze? Were there prior connections, for instance, with the Fatimid Ismaili da'wah? My next question is about what I am going to call the dark age of Druze history, which is between the closing of the da'wah around 1042 and the emergence of Al-Sayed and the tradition surrounding him during the 15th century. In his book, Wissam rightly calls this une histoire perdue, a lost history. So my understanding from his book is that this is a period in which the Druze canon, the Hekmah, comes to be consolidated and preserved, but we know remarkably little about what else is happening in Druze history at this time. So my question directly to him is, what precisely was happening during this dark age, this so-called dark age? If so little was happening, how did the Druze community survive at all? One could imagine a counter history, an alternative version of events in which, far from consolidating and surviving to the time of Al-Sayed, the Druze da'wah went the way of countless other small religious movements in medieval Islamic history and simply disappeared when its converts dried up and when state patronage disappeared. What was its internal structure during this obscure period? Let me see. Yeah.
I mean, maybe Wissam can start by answering these two questions, and then if,
okay, great. I'll leave my other questions, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Kirsten.
Thanks, Christians, for your very kind presentation. I'm very happy that you like the book, even though it's in French and very thick. I think that you asked me 3 questions. The first one on manuscripts. In fact, yes, the problem of Druze studies is that all Western scholars were interested or studied or focused on the epistles of the Hikmah, because we can find them very easily in all libraries, in all European libraries, and I think in some American ones. They did not, in fact, pay any attention to small texts that were very disseminated in the manuscripts where the Hikmah, the epistles of the Hikmah were written, copied. So this was the main problem, I would say, when I started my research 15 years ago. I mean, to say something new about Druze, we had to have new manuscripts. It wasn't enough to read in any book written by Lebanese or Syrian historians or even Israeli historians that they have in their private library texts or manuscripts on which they base their analysis. We can't do history like this. We have to be able to read these manuscripts and to find them. So this, I started my research looking for manuscripts, for new manuscripts, and I found these, what I call the great exegeses, which are fragments of manuscripts that I had to put into a puzzle. I don't know if you say this in English. So anyway, so it was long, but it was the only way to have a fresh look on the Druze history. These treaties, which I call theological for one and legal for the others, I didn't even know that it was legal treaties, so I had to read them to collapse them anyway. So they are kept, and you have all the references in the book, in European libraries, mainly in Paris and Berlin, but I mean there are more libraries, academic libraries, where we can find some manuscripts and Druze manuscripts. So this was a very big part of my work, and of course we cannot do history based just on legal treaties. So we had to to find narrative accounts that we can understand in a historical way, like local chronicles. So this is just, tell me if I don't fully respond to your question, Christian. Feel easy to ask me. Your second question about converts. Oh, it's really a very interesting question, but it's really a very difficult one. I mean, really, we have no accounts, no information about people who converted to Druzism in Cairo or in Syria. We have less information about converts in Cairo. I mean, if we read Arabic medieval authors like Al-Makrizi or Al-Antaqi or whatever, they will say that these converts were simple-minded or poor people or low-class people. I mean, but it's normal for them to say that because they hated this Druze movement, which in their opinion was composed from heretics only. So they wouldn't say that there were good people converting to Druzism. We know, however, that the founders of this movement were Ismaili Dais. So these Ismaili Dais, and when we read the epistles, we can't believe, but it's just a hypothesis. I would never write this, but just a hypothesis that the content of the epistles are addressed to a public who is able to understand it. So with a very complicated doctrine. So maybe there is something here to analyze about converts, but I wouldn't go so far. About Christians, in fact, we think, and De Smet had the same opinion once we discussed about this, that Al-Muqtana, the Ismaili Da'i which I mentioned, was Christian, because in his epistles we have some epistles written by him or attributed to him that go very deep into Christian doctrine. As well as in the 15th century in the Kitab al-Sharh, which is a theological unpublished book or a sum of treaties, we have some treaties that are very about Christians, as if these authors, scholars, knew very well the Christian doctrine. And they go very far into the analysis and the comparison between Druzism and Christianity. And of course, they have Mary and Jesus in a great deal. So they accord a lot of importance to them. And you're right. I mean, the epistles, we know that the da'wah wasn't only in Syria. It was also in Yemen, for example, or even in India. We have some information about this. But as I mentioned in the first chapter, the preliminary chapter of the book, I think, and contrary to what my master said, De Smet, I think that the epistles of the Hikmah are not, we don't have all the epistles of the Hikmah. I think that the Hikmah, the book, the sacred book, is a sum of treaties which were available in Syria. And so, and now I go to your third question, because it's a good transition. So the epistles of the Hikmah were canonized in Syria during this dark age of Druze history that you mentioned, and you mentioned rightly. I mean, we don't have another information about the organization of the community. We don't even know if the Druze were a community at all at that time. But we know that the epistles weren't a sacred book in the 11th century, and that the Hikmah was elaborated, réuni, recueilli, you can translate, and become a book and a sacred book during this dark age, because all the literature that we have written in the 15th century mentioned the Hikmah as a sacred book. So it was already a sacred book. And I think that this book has been elaborated in Syria, in the Gharb, in the 14th century, or at least in the 13th century. So because we have no other explanation to the fact that we have no epistles, no information about families a part of Syrian families from the Gharb. You know, so this, so we don't know the internal structure of the community. And I repeat myself, but it's important to keep this in mind. We can't presume that there was any community at that time, but we are sure that there were groups of intellectuals, of spirituals, religious people, teachers with disciples, who continued to copy the epistles, and who continued teaching the Hikmah to their disciples, but secretly, in a very secret way, because it is an esoteric group. So this is what we are sure about it, but we can't say that there were legal rules. I mean, Druze people didn't have any rules before the 15th century, and Druze law is I mean, the branches, what we say positive law or substantive law in Druze law is so even though Usul al-Fiqh and Usul al-Din are Ismailis, so we can imagine very small groups of teachers and disciples continuing learning the epistles, and without considering that they were Druze or religious or of course religious, but Druze and a religion apart, or not Muslims or Christian. You know, I think that they considered themselves Muslim, and the Druzism at that time was a aqidah, a doctrine, an esoteric doctrine. That's all. So, and they followed Sunni fiqh like everyone in these regions in Syria in pre-modern time. So I hope that I responded to your questions, Christian. I tried with my very good English to respond, and I hope that I was really very clear.
Extremely clear, and I think it was good that Fârès cut me off, because we would have been speaking for even longer. So yes, excellent answers. Thank you.
Yes, it was very interesting, and just to stay on this last subject that you were talking about. So this pre Al-Sayed Druzism, so to speak. So you say we're not sure that it was a community back then, and it was probably just a aqidah, so a spiritual doctrine. Do we have any documents dating this period? I mean, is there any written production from these Druze circles of that time that have survived until now, or?
Extremely rare. I analyze some sentences that are written in the text of the 15th century about previous periods. So we have just some sentences that says that say how Al-Sayed and his disciples who wanted to put in place a Druze law or a law or special learning and teaching of the hikmah were considered as innovators, bid'ah. So the others refused because the Sayyidism or the Sayyid and his disciples wanted to give the priority to people who were the disciples and members of this school of law. Some authors mention texts that might have been written before. I think that, really, I passed many years looking for Druze manuscripts. I think that we have no other writing that survived from this so-called dark age, and that the first writings we have are from mid-15th century. Even the hikmah, we don't have any copy or fragment copy that is not from, at least from the middle of the mid-15th century. You have to put your voice on. Yes, micro on.
So on the same, it's not exactly the same question, but in these writings, so starting in the 15th century and forth, do we have any allusions to, pre-15th century rulings, or for example, in the texts that you were working on dealing with marriage, do they allude to how was marriage contracted before this period, before the 15th century, or are there no allusions at all to these?
Yes, thanks for the question. It's really very important. I'm thinking how to respond without taking an hour. So yes, we have so many informations about customs in the Gharb, in this area, in the Syrian area, and many customs, local rules, were family rules and clan rules, so, or rural rules, if you prefer. So I prefer clan rules because we see how Druze law, well, for me, I'm very interested in history of Islamic law. And for me, I consider that law and rules, legal rules, come from the society and not the other way. So we see that jurists, pre-modern jurists, they forbid or they accept custom rules that were mentioned, that are mentioned in narrative in other texts from this period, from the 14th and 15th century. We can take the example of polygamy and well, that the Druze don't accept polygamy, for example, for a man to marry many women. But this, we can find it in the custom rules in the Gharb, within the Banu Buhtur, and it is the same. It is not, there's nothing religious in it. They weren't progressive, these scholars either. They just wanted to keep peace within their community. And their community, when you study texts we have, sources we have, you understand that there were few families and they couldn't marry many women, and they couldn't divorce and they couldn't dispute because it was just villages and people, everyone knowing each other, you know. So yes, we have informations about, I mean, we can get some information from narrative sources, especially. I mean, I can go further, but I think that
No, but it's
I won't
it's
go
fine
into detail.
for today. Christian, did you have any other topics that you wanted to bring up?
I'm hesitant because I know people have many questions, but maybe I can, because it's actually my key question, and I think it goes to the heart of the book, and I'll try to put it succinctly. So given that the Druze moved from a period of obscurity to a period of visibility and high organization, what caused the change? So why did it happen in the 15th century, and why did it happen in the Gharb versus at any point earlier, any point later, in any other region?
And if I may, I would like also to, well, take this question a little bit further and ask, I mean, what is it that made the success of Al-Sayed, and maybe not Al-Sayed himself, but Sayyidism, because I think you establish a distinction between the rulings by Al-Sayed and what became afterwards attributed to him and was actually built by his disciples, and this is what you call Sayyidism. So what is it that makes the success of Sayyidism?
Well, thank you for the question. Well, it's the same question, and I will try to respond. So it's very clear that spiritual or religious leaders before Al-Sayed were never members of the elite, of local elites. So there are two things. The first thing is that the Banu Bahtor, who were emirs, became very strong, start from the mid of the 14th century. So they had fuqaha who went, or scholars who went to learn in Damascus, and many were from the main family of the Emir Al-Sayed. So the Emir Al-Sayed, as I mentioned it in my talk, but very quickly, had both this spiritual era or spiritual legitimacy, prestige, and the temporal or material or the elite prestige. So he was a noble, he was an emir, and he was member of the famous family and branch family of the Gharb, who reigned on all the region. This is one reason. The other reason is not far from the first one. He had money, so he had power, he had a social status, he had knowledge, and he had money because one of the scholars of his family gave him into his iqta, or put his iqta in his benefit, we would say. And so he had all the elements to succeed and to have disciples. This is fair. And members of his disciples were emirs as well, not only small, poor peasants, we say, agriculteurs, peasants from villages who were not known, who were unknown, and who were no mean to develop anything. So this is a real reason to explain the fact that the disciples of the emir were visible. but the disciples of the Emir, and if we have any written texts that have been kept until now, it is because these texts have been written, were written into this milieu where there were emirs with palaces, I mean, they wanted to be emirs, real emirs with secretary and kutab and all things, you know. So, and they were rich and they wanted to have power. So that's why I think, and I'm sure about this, there's no other explanation to understand why the Druzism in the Druze communities, the only community where there was something new happening on theological side or on a legal side, was in the Gharb. We have no other reason to explain that. And this is why, I mean, this teachings became not far from the second part of the 16th century, the majority. I mean, the only teachings that were followed by all the Druze communities. I'm working now on another manuscript that is a treatise of law written in the 17th century, the beginning of 17th century, and at that time the teachings attributed to Al-Sayed, and in fact was his disciples, were the rule to follow in Druze communities and the only rules to follow. So in my opinion, this explains the whole situation, the social and political context and the economic context, explain why this group succeeded.
Thank you, Wissam. That's very enlightening. Did you have any other comments, Christian, before I take some questions from the audience?
No, not at all.
All right. So yes, I'll convey to you, Wissam, a few questions from the audience, and well, some of them are actually asking things that I wanted to ask, so I will blend these, mix all these questions together. And so we have a few questions about the relationship of Druzism to Ismailism. So this is a very wide question, but we can maybe restrict it to one or 2 points. So, for example, so on the theological aspects, how long can we say the Ismaili terminology survives in Druze doctrine? That's for one question. And the other one is, to what extent can we speak of an influence of Qadi al-Nu'man's fiqh on later Druze law as it appears, you know, starting from the 15th century? I mean, I know that, as you explained, Hamza substituted the 7 precepts to the 7 pillars of Islam as theorized by Al-Qadi al-Nu'man, but so theoretically Al-Qadi al-Nu'man is not really, should not be really a source for Druzism. But I mean, is there any trace, any reference to him in these legal works that you were working on and that you mentioned?
Yes. So the relationship between Druzism and Ismailism, and about the Ismaili terminology, well, it's really obvious for someone who reads the epistles, for example, that all the terminology is Ismaili. Even though, as I said, Imam Hamza and after him Al-Muqtana use these concepts and notions and arrange them in a new way. But I mean, yes, they had a new Imam. The Imam was an intellect. Salman al-Farisi, I mean, and you have the Aql, but I mean, not the same structure, not the same order, but the same terminology, the same spirit of mind, I would say, the same basis of the religious or spiritual system. So it's for 100% sure that Druzism in theology, and we have the proof on this by reading the unpublished, but we have to work on this, the Sharh al-Kashf, which is a theological treatise that use the same Ismaili terminology. The influence of Al-Qadi al-Nu'man is more complicated to analyze. So we can imagine that the Druze movement and Druze dies, or Hamza, or the Muwahidun, they never call themselves Druzes anyway, were against Al-Qadi al-Nu'man, or at least his books or his doctrines. So because they were against all the Fatimid doctrine, I mean, we, for the Druze and the Druze doctrine, the Fatimids were trying to be into orthodoxy and keeping after them, or behind them, sorry, the real doctrine of the real Ismaili doctrine. So they were against Al-Qadi al-Nu'man, but at the same time, they took a lot of Al-Qadi al-Nu'man. So it's very complicated to analyze, and we can take many other examples. For example, the Imam Al-Sadiq, so they can quote Imam Al-Sadiq, but they will never say that he is an Imam. So it's very complicated. The doctrine, the Druze doctrine, I mean, it's not me who said that, but Daniel de Smet, that the Druze doctrine was a link between pre-Fatimid Ismaili doctrine and post-Fatimid Ismaili doctrine. So maybe he's right. But anyway, the influence of Al-Qadi al-Nu'man should be more investigated, and I haven't done this work yet, sorry.
Okay, thank you. So another question, I mean, we have a few questions on the specifics of the Druze law. So Yahya Baiza asks, are there any other significant rulings in the Druze family law other than how to discipline your wife? And why is this one so important in the entire Druze fiqh? So I think the question is about why you chose this specific example, and what is it that is specifically interesting about the Druze understanding of this
Okay.
ruling?
Sorry, who's asking the question?
Yahya Baiza, he's one of our colleagues in.
Okay, dear Yahya, I think that I was very lazy, and because I wrote an article on the subject, so I used this case. I've just wrote the article, so it's not yet published, but it will be. And to be more serious, but this was true, to be more serious, when you read Druze law and legal treaties, you can, it's very clear that they put a lot of energy to establish rules on marriage and divorce, and to regulate the status of the woman, because for them, for pre-modern jurists, which is something that doesn't exist in the Hikmah, we don't have to confuse between the two texts. For pre-modern Druze jurists, it was essential for Druzes to marry other Druzes and not from outside the community. And when I say outside the community, it means outside the family. We have an account, nothing religious, a narrative account about an emir from the 14th century who dared marrying an Egyptian woman So he was banned. His father took all his heritage, and he couldn't live in the Gharb anymore. And it wasn't about religion. So you see that for Druze jurists, they had the community identity in mind. And for them, marriage was the basis of this. So if Druzes should keep being Druzes, still keep staying Druzes anyway, you understood, they should marry into the community and not outside the community. And nowadays, this is a rule that is very important among Druze communities, even though, 90% of Druze people doesn't know a word about their religion, but they know, the only thing they know is that they must not marry from outside the community.
That's very interesting. I mean, it really shows how marriage, as you said, is really a pillar of the construction of a collective communitarian identity. So we have another question from Julien Darmon, who asks, who says, "Thank you for your wonderful presentation. You spoke about nascent Druzism as Rulat. Are we able to say to what extent, beyond the factual identification of Al-Hakim as Nasut, the Druze theology breaks with internal Ismaili theology and early Shia speculations? Also, do the early Druze, especially Hamza, view themselves as merely revealing the true meaning of Islam, or as ushering a new religion altogether? In other words, did they see themselves as Muslims or as something beyond that? And how did this perception evolve until now?"
Well, I think that there are two questions in one.
Yes, I mean, the first one is more about, well, in what sense maybe can we say that the Druze doctrine stems from Ghulu? And the second question is more...
Yes, so let's talk about Ghulu and the meaning that I didn't translate the term Ghulu because I don't agree with the translation with the term extremists. So I hate this term for Ghulu. So when because it's not correct, it's incorrect in Arabic terms. It's incorrect. I mean, Ghulu, Ghala, it's someone who is putting more and more. So we can say exaggerators. So and Ghulu is exaggerations and not extremism. I mean, extremism, there is a judgment from the others who are judging them as extremists. So it's negative, while themselves think that others are heretics also. So anyway, how can we say that the Druze or the Druze doctrine is a part of the Ghulu or the Ghulat? Well, first, it's really very impressive that they consider that Al-Hakim, who's a caliph, and who had a son and who married, and whose mother was Christian, I mean, that he had never had a son, never married, and so on. So, and that he is the Nasut. I mean, the Nasut is really the keystone of Druze doctrine. So if you don't think or believe that Al-Hakim is the Nasut, it means the God human figure on earth or something like that. You can't be a true believer or a true Druze. So this is Ghala, this is exaggeration, and we can see this not only, I mean, with Druze, we can see this in at many times with many imams, even Al-Sadiq, or we have some accounts, I don't know if they are real, about Ali and so on. So this is first considered as a Ghulu doctrine. The second one is that they were antinomist. how we say antinomist in English?
Antinomian.
Antinomian, something like that. So they were against any religious, any legal or substantive law. So we have this contradiction in Druze history. So in the 11th century, in the epistles, all Islamic law was abrogated. So because God, or not God, but I'm going very quickly, the human part of God was on earth, so no substantive law was necessary or was needed for people to follow rules, because they had the human or the human will or the divine will instead of on earth. But so they didn't have to follow any substantive rule. The only rule Imam Hamza is talking about in the epistles is what he calls spiritual law. So we don't really know what spiritual law is, because he's not explicit about this. I mean, for this, the Druze doctrine in the 11th century was a Ghulat doctrine. I mean, I'm not going into detail, but I mean, they have a particular explication of Allah as a God or not. The Prophet Muhammad has a particular status, Ali also. So it is something that is something as exaggeration, and many authors, medieval authors, consider them as ghulat, and more than ghulat, even the more extremists of ghulat. So anyway, what was the second question, Fârès, please?
The second question was, well, how to what extent did Hamza pretend to, reveal the true meaning of Islam, or I mean, did he consider himself as bringing a new religion, or being in the continuity of Islam and revealing the true meaning of Islam?
Well, thank you. Yes, it is a very good question, in fact, and it is a very actual question. Well, to be honest, I think that Hamza wasn't concerned by this subject, in fact, and it wasn't his concern whether the doctrine that we call the Druze Doctrine was a religion or a doctrine or a sectarian doctrine or whatever. For him, it was the right doctrine, the truth about God, religion, cosmic world, etc. So, but for current Druze scholars, it is a problem, because current Druze scholars are, I mean, it's something that divides I mean, you have two groups of scholars nowadays within the Druze community. You have those who consider the Druzism as a religion, a whole religion, I mean, a religion as apart from Islam, from Christianity, and so on. And those who consider that Druzism is just a doctrine within Islam, even though for them the Druze doctrine, I mean, abrogated the Sunni doctrines and Shia doctrines. They consider that they are esoteric, they are in the inner meaning of the Quran, that the Quran is a very important book that should be explained based on its inner meaning, and that the Shia were wrong by explaining what they explained, because they didn't have the knowledge to do it, because the only knowledge could come from the Nasud, who was Al-Hakim, and who gave it to Hamza, his Imam, the Imam. So yes, it is a problem in the Druze community. It is not resolved. It's none of my business, in fact, I would say, because it's not a scientific debate.
No, the content is not a scientific debate exactly, but it's interesting to know how that this debate exists in
It does exist. I mean, I have a whole chapter in my book about this because it is important, because it's ideological, and because it's a way of self-viewing the community to which these authors belong. You know, so when I mean, it's about time, and when the Druze were very powerful politically, they wanted just to be a religion. When Daesh is there, they wanted just to be a doctrine, and doctrine that is okay with Sunnism. So, you know, so they are esoteric, so they can say whatever they want.
Okay, we have a few questions from Omar Ali Deonzaga, who is the head of Department of Quranic Studies at the IAS. So he asks, Nejla Abu Izzeddin's book mentions Al-Sayed's library, but she does not expand. What do we know about it, in particular about the possible influences from the Rasail Ikhwan al-Safa and Sufi texts? I mean influences on Al-Sayed, but also on later Druze literature.
Yes, Nejla Abu Izzeddin books is a bad book, even though it's published in a very good collection. It's a bad book because she's writing in a very good way something that is very ideological, as well as Sami Makarim when he wrote the Druze Faith. The aim of these authors is to explain to which extent Druzism and the Druze Doctrine is in continuity with the Fatimid doctrine, and to which extent Druze are into Islam, but they go no further. It is just a publicity for Druze community, and they are Druze authors, and they always base their research on private libraries that do not exist. That's all. So I mean, we have no evidence that, yes, I worked on the library of Al-Sayed because I have the Waqf, the testimonial document that I found written in the 11th century. So we know that he had books, and that these books went to his disciples, and he mentioned everything about this. So for the second part of the question about Sufism and the influence of Sufism, I think, and Ikhwan Safa.
The Ikhwan Safa, yes.
So so Sufism is something that came later in the 17th century. Also in my book, I have a chapter on this. Sorry, I'm saying that always my book, but
No, but
I mean, yes, I
work
work on this because it is, it is a real question. It's very important, and that's why there's a whole chapter or a part of a chapter on this. So Sufism is something that came later, and the influence of the Sufi thought is can be analyzed, in fact, but more in the 17th century, when Druzism, when Druze scholars try to make the Druze doctrine popular. So we have in the 17th century an influence of Sufism, but also an influence of Christianity. So you have catechism. I don't know how we say catechism in English. Sorry. Catechism. That is exactly like the Christian catechism. That is, which is written, was written in the 17th century, and that didn't exist before. And we have this image of Emir Al-Sayed as a saint, with all the qualities of saint, but not like the sanctity with miracles in the Sufism. But we can say that now there are some Druze scholars, religious scholars, who think, who would like to make links between Druzism and Sufism, just to, I mean, they think that they are very close. Well, whereas they have not any structure in common, and they are not like Harufi community who took from Shia and from Sufism. It's not the case for Druze. About Ikhwan al-Safa are very important for the Druze. For example, when they meet every Friday evening, the laymen, the Druze laymen, who are not initiated or not religious yet, can assist to the first part of the sessions of teaching, and the first part is opened with Ikhwan Safa text. So for them, it is this text is these texts are really very important, and all Druze religious people that I met, know very well the Ikhwan Safa text, as far as I know, as they know Plato. Voilà. So for them, these are very important.
That's indeed very interesting. I mean, do we have an idea or an estimation of when did this start? When the Ikhwan were included in Druze ritual, or
maybe one day I should work more.
It's just
I should work more. Sorry.
No. I mean, I was just wondering if
maybe I don't know if I have any indication about that in the 15th text in the text written in the 15th century. I can't say, but in the 17th century it's for sure. But 17th century it's too late. So the aim is to know if in the 15th century there's any mention of the Ikhwan Safa text or not.
So we have some questions about a topic that you did not mention, which is reincarnation. And so someone is, Malik Rassamni is asking, to what extent is reincarnation as a Druze belief present in official or in folk discourses in the medieval ages? And Isabel Miller is asking, how did these early lawmakers marry the belief in reincarnation of the individuals of the community with the deployment of Shafi'i law? Or is there absolutely no connection? Can they run side by side?
Yes, reincarnation is a real problem, I know. Reincarnation doesn't exist in the epistles of the Hikmah, as maybe you know, most probably. So it's a construction later on made by scholars. We have the first real treatise on incarnation. I can date it from the 16th century, not before. I don't really want to say more about reincarnation because I don't want to say something that I will discover in a couple of years that it's wrong, because I don't know if there's any influence from other Ismaili communities on Druzes about reincarnation. I don't know. It's a question. It's a hypothesis. So that I would like to investigate one day. In the 11th century text, the reincarnation is not at all the main topic. We can find some indications that we can analyze as reincarnation, but I'm not sure that we can say that the doctrine of reincarnation was completed in the 11th century. I'm not sure. This wasn't the main or absolutely the concern of scholars at that time. Their concern was to explain how cosmic principles use, like Hamza, their soul used to be in a different bodies, in a different moments. So Hamza was Jesus, was Adam, Jesus, then Salman al-Farisi, then Hamza. But they don't, so this is in Usul al-Din, and Usul al-Din are very important for Usul al-Fiqh, but they don't really talk about this in the substantive law. So you can have the feeling that substantive law in Druzism are in a little bit disconnected from Usul al-Fiqh and principle of laws, from law, and from Usul al-Din in Druzism. So really, I mean, it's an opportunity for me to make this clearer about Shafi'ism and the influence of Shafi'ism. In an article that I wrote 3 years ago, I investigated the influence of Malikism on Druzism, on Druze law. So you just have to keep in mind that for Druze jurists, pre-modern Druze jurists, banned all Islamic law, Sunni, Shi'i, every Islamic law. But they cherry pick. This is a good expression, English one, I like it. They cherry pick whatever they need, or from being influenced by their teachers, and to adapt it to their local environment. So, for example, about the divorce and women asking for the divorce and the right for a woman to ask for a divorce, this is very close to Malikism and not to Shafi'ism. But on permissibility of wife beating, as a last resort, it's much closer to Shafi'ism than to Malikism. So, and it's not strange, because Malikism and Shafi'ism, I don't know. I have to investigate more about Hanbalism, but there were doctrines that were very popular at that time in these mountains. I'm working on the Maronites, and the same mountains, they had Shafi'i qadis most of the time. So we know that Shafi'ism was very not popular, but everywhere there.
Disseminated in this area.
Yes.
Right. So about this influence of Sunnism, very briefly. We're soon going to run out of time, but I was wondering what prompted the Druze scholars to follow courses with. You say that Druze scholars are trained in Damascus or Aleppo with Sunni scholars. So, how long had this been going on for, and what may have been the factors that have prompted the Druze scholars to do this? Why would they take fiqh lessons with Sunni scholars?
Well, we don't have the name of the teachers. I think that we have the name of one that I forgot. Sorry. I identified one in the narrative literature. But we know that the emirs of the Gharb used to go to Damascus to learn, to learn to copy the Quran, to learn all sciences traditional sciences, we say in English. So the Sira, the Tafsir, and so on. So it's mentioned in the texts, and that when you read them, they know everything about Islamic law and the Hadith and they know a lot of things. And even Emir Al-Sayed, in one of the texts written by one of his disciples, they qualified him as they described him as a muhaddith. And so, and emirs, I mean, the Banu Buhtur constructed, do we say constructed, built a mosque in their village, and they had an imam who said the prayer. And we have a narrative accounts. They say that when the Sultan was passing by, his imam was wrong on the prayer, but the local imam, which was a Druze, wasn't wrong, and he corrected him. And then the Sultan, thanked him for correcting his own imam. So it is exaggerated, I know. It could be not real, but they always, in these texts of that time, always have the writers always had this necessity to say that they were Muslims, and they even knew Islam and the Quran better than other scholars, and better than the Damascus scholars especially.
Thank you very much, Wissam. Thank you for your patient answers to all our questions, and thank you for agreeing to present today. Unless Christian has last comments or last questions, we are going to Christian.
You know, I'll just say, hearing you speak, Wissam, it makes me like you. I'm very interested in the Maronites and the other communities in the coastal mountains of Syria, and for me, the big takeaway is the Mamluk context, the way in which the rise of the Banu Buhtur as clients of the Mamluks changes the situation for the entire community. This seems to be the main context for the creation of this madhab, right? So it's what helps the community reach out of the mountain to gain political patronage, to gain economic clout that it didn't have at an earlier point. And this in turn kind of creates around them a religious culture that did not exist or was not as widespread. And it reminds me of the situation of the Maronites in previous centuries, in the time of the Crusaders, where this is a community that is again up in the mountains with relatively few contacts in lowland areas. And the arrival of this major power that installs itself on the coast creates relationships that then institutionalizes the church and clarifies doctrine in a way that had not happened in the period before. And as you know, the history of the Maronites is as murky as the history of the Druze in this period. But I think there's perhaps a parallel situation to think about there. What happens when these mountain communities make contact with powerful empires or invaders on the coast, and what that does to the religious culture, doctrine, organization of the community. So anyway, there's much more to say, but I'll stop there. And this was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Well, thank you again, Wissam, and we were very happy to have you both
of you. I was really very happy, and thank you again, Christian, for all what you've said, and thank you, Fârès, for your questions and for inviting me. I hope that we'll meet soon, not on Zoom anymore.
Allah.
Inshallah.
And I wish all the success to your newly published book.
Thank you. Thank you.
So it would be well deserved.
See you soon.
Bye. Bye.